Hey everybody, I am back today with another Saga battle report. We have a 6-point game of Vikings versus Anglo-Danes. We're playing the Fords scenario, and we're actually all set up for deployment. The Vikings actually have the initiative. They're basically going to be going first, and this is the setup right here. Anglo-Danes right in front of you here. Vikings gathered on this hill, and some in the forests, approaching this little beginnings of the settlement, I suppose, of the Anglo-Danes, perhaps. And there we go. We will see you at the end of round one. So we're at the end of round one. There's been no fighting yet, but both masses of armies have rushed towards each other. A fairly aggressive movement turn. Vikings did go first, and during the Viking player's turn, 2 movement actions were made for this group of Hearthguard. They actually didn't initially get a fatigue for doing the double movement action because they used the ability Njord, which actually was able to take that away. I'll talk later about why that fatigue is there. But essentially, that's what ended up happening, is they just rushed forward, just as Vikings do. And during the Anglo-Dane turn, similarly, the Danes went forward, but the Danes did use the trapped ability, because lots of the helmeted 6s on the battle board were rolled, and that allowed 3 fatigues to be placed on 3 different units within the Vikings' table or army. And so that's kind of where we're at. You know, this unit of Hearthguard didn't have the dice to go up forward, but essentially everyone else has moved forward. The Warlord is going towards the right fjord here, whereas the Warlord for the Vikings is actually coming up to the one here on the left. We have levies that are positioned off to the side with their slingers, and then we have warriors coming up for the Danes, trying to block the fjord. But then on both sides we have, it looks like, primarily Hearthguard for the Vikings that are actually crossing the fjord here, as well as over here up at the lip, approaching the lip of the fjord. So we will come back after the end of round 2. Hey everybody, we're at the end of round 2. So we have actually saw some significant action this turn. The Vikings did pour through the ford here and ram into the warriors of the Anglo-Danes. The last member of that group is this warrior with the shield up in the air. Essentially, my opponent used Frigg and Hemdall, 2 battle board abilities, to increase his attack abilities, remove some fatigue that he had, and as well reduce his armor by 1 in the combat. But he had a big group of Hearthguard there, so they were able to deal with that little bit of lesser armor and all their extra attacks and actually come out on top. Now, prior to that happening, I did use Intimidation again, so I made him use 2 dice to be able to do that movement, and that ended up leaving this group over here on the other side of the ford still in the position just outside of the woods. They've not moved yet because he's used all of his movement on this side. During the Anglo-Danes turn, no attacks were made, but I ended up using Trapped again, the ability, and added an extra fatigue on the same 3 units, so now he has 2 fatigues on these units. And then I moved some of my other units up, like my Warlord and my small group of Hearthguard there. And so the warriors for the Anglo-Danes have moved up into the ford and are looking to cross the ford. Alright, so that's where we're at for end of round 2. See you at the end of round 3. Okay, we're at end of round 3, and we've had a fairly bloody turn. Initially, the Vikings' Hearthguard came through and attacked the Danes that were the Huskarls with the axes, and actually ended up really rolling not very well and ended up losing that combat and moving back. There is one more Dane left from that group right there. But shortly after that, the warriors sort of took up the slack and came through from behind. That initial attack was with side by side with the warlord, but they did lose that. The warriors came through and then wiped out what was left of the Huskarls with the axes. After that, that was primarily it, because these guys over here were fairly fatigued. They didn't move up. Now, that was a really big victory, though, because it's really wiped out a lot of the warriors on this side of the table and the Huskarls on the Dane side. Now, levies did sling at the remaining 2 Hearthguard and killed one of them, and with those slings. Now, there was my opponent did use the ability, a Viking ability called Asgard, to minimize their shooting. And so that's why, they still got one, but they were having a harder time to begin with because of that Viking ability. On this side over here, the Danes during their turn used Lords of Battle and came up against the Hearthguard, which had a fatigue, and used the initial fatigue against them. Ended up winning the combat, but the way the Lords of Battle works is that you add an additional 2 fatigue. So they won the combat and then drove the Hearthguard back, and now the Hearthguard have 3 fatigue. Danes have 1. Finally, the Danish warlord is moving up behind, trying to get to the other side of the board. And so that's sort of where we end up. Lots of a bloody defeat over here on the Danes on this side, a loss in combat, and some heavy fatigue generation on the Hearthguard on this side. Okay, we will now see you at the end of round 4. Hey everybody, we are back at the end of turn 4. 2 things happened in the Vikings' turn. They had a very good turn. The Herdmen Hearthguard ended up sweeping the warriors on the Dane side here. It was a good battle. There are definitely less Herdmen left, but they actually swept the 7 warriors off the table. Then on this side, the remaining warriors ended up killing the last of the Huskarls that were on the Dane side here, and I think that was primarily it on the Vikings' turn. But then on the Danes' turn, the levies did actually end up killing 2 warriors by slaying them. Then on this side here, the Huskarls moved up in order to attack in retribution these herdmen, but ended up rolling just horribly, didn't get 1 hit, and lost the combat, lost 2 out of the 4 of them, and then they retreated backwards. And so now we have the warlord on the Dane side approaching the field from the other side with 2 remaining Huskarls, but honestly the Danes' situation is looking kind of bleak, but we will see what happens in the remaining turns. Be back at the end of turn 5. Well, we were at the end of turn 5, and the bitter end has come for the Anglo-Danes. Essentially, the main thing that happened in this turn is we had the warlord and the 2 Huskarls behind him, and they were rushed by the in the Vikings' first part of the turn by the 3 herdmen, and what essentially happened is the warlord missed every single shot that when the herdmen came in and charged them. They did actually provide 3 wounds to the warlord. Now the first one he passes off because of his warlord ability, but then the other 2 he was able to soak right behind him to the 2 Huskarls that were behind him, so they sort of took it for the warlord, and then what happened was the Vikings do have a special rule that he was able to use. I think it was called, that was Thor, where you actually immediately do another round of melee after that one. And during that round, the Danish warlord was able to take one of the herdmen out, but then they did end up putting down the Warlord. And so what we're left with at the end of turn 5 is really just levies and the Warlord on each side here. I have no Saga dice with the Anglo-Danes because the levies don't generate Saga dice, so they really can't do anything. So really what would happen at this point is, even at turn 5, like, he would win by having the Warlord here, but then turns, you know, if the game was to continue, I wouldn't be able to do anything. He would move his Vikings up and they would basically win by crossing the ford. And so I've conceded to the Vikings. Like I mentioned in my chat yesterday, we'd had a discussion after this. I just really need to lighten up my levies, like not take so many levies and just paint some more warriors and get some other units on the table. But it was a good game, though. It was very interesting. We had some very interesting rolls. We had times on both sides where the rolls were very one-sided, where we thought that, you know, where we statistically had it in the bag, you know, we didn't. And that did change the course of how the game went in different spots. But it was an excellent game. Hope you enjoyed it. And hopefully I'll be doing some more Saga battle reports. Take care.